Okay, so this is a surprise video. So, and this is going to be a public one too. It's not an aftercare. So, in the Ugliest Man Alive campaign, where I'm playing that Dragonborn Samurai, he recently got access to his family swords, which are made of this material called star metal, which he has now positively identified thanks to a metallurgist, blacksmith dude. And one thing that's been confirmed is that they absorb elemental, we'll call it, power, and they store it very effectively. So that's going to be like one of this character's like main interactive kind of damage sources. So we've been going back and forth exactly what that means. And for the most part, which we've ironed out, and this is more the DM's decision than mine, because I'm just the player. I just use the things you give me. But mostly how it works is you can set the blades in some source of elemental power, like, say, a bonfire, for an amount of time. And then it'll gain extra damage for basically one attack. On your next attack that hits, basically. So, and this damage scales up with the amount of time it spends in the source and with the intensity of the source. So if it's in a little campfire for an hour, it'll gain like a D4 or a D6, a small damage die, and it'll gain one of those. But then in that same campfire, it'll gain like 2d4 or 2d6. And then if you leave it in overnight, if you just leave it in for like a few minutes, it'll gain like a d4. If you leave it in for like a short rest or a few hours, it'll gain like 2d4. And if you leave it in overnight or like a long rest, it'll gain 3d4. Like, that's kind of the scaling idea. But then likewise, instead of a bonfire, if you were to leave it in like a huge blacksmith's forge that's just constantly going, you might get, instead of getting D4s, you might get D8s or D10s or D whatevers. So that's kind of how it scales up. And in the middle of the discussions, like, my instinct was that, what was my instinct exactly? It would be like the intensity of the source determines the amount of dice, and the time spent in the source determines the size of the die. So it would have been like, okay, if you leave it in a campfire, you get 1d whatever. And then, like, if you leave it in for a few minutes, you get a D4. If you leave it in overnight, it's a D6 or a D8. Or if you leave it in for a few hours, it's a D6 or a D8. And then if you leave it in for a short rest, it's like a D8 or a D10. But that campfire only ever gives you one, because it's such a small source of fire. Whereas if you leave it in that forge, it would be like 3D whatever, depending on the amount of time. And my thought process there is, that one, the intensity of the elemental source is more important, and mathematically, number of dice is more valuable. 4d6 versus 6d4. 6d4 will have an average of 3, will have 3 higher damage on average, which isn't a lot, but it's still technically better. So That was my thought process. But then it gets like, maybe it gets a little unintuitive in how the damage scales. So instead, doing it the other way around, the source determines the size of the die, and then the time spent determines the number, probably works better. And then some of the other thoughts are like, okay, my character's a Dragonborn, he has a breath weapon. And one thing we've been doing, or that I've been doing in this campaign with this character, is that, like, I can use, like, a small exhalation of breath, like a little puff to, like, chill a drink, or mostly just chill drinks, cool down food, because I decided one of the things about Silver Dragonborn, at least my particular one, is that he likes his food cold, so he freezes his food. So that's just one of those things, and he uses little puffs of breath to do it. And we make a con check. It's funny. But then, if you can do that, then do I just have a complete continual free source of this? And more or less, yeah. But it's just, if I do that free version, it basically takes an action to do so. Maybe we'll rule it different. Maybe it takes a bonus action or something else, depending on how it goes when we play. Because an action could be expensive, but maybe it's supposed to be that this is the type of thing that takes prep to do. So, you know. And it's basically just like, okay, you do this, you get an extra D4 cold damage. And that's it. That's fine, because it's free. It's just free damage. But then it's, how would it interact with a full use of my breath weapon? You know, where it comes out in a 15-foot cone, and at this level it does 2d10 damage. How'd that work? What exactly, like, if I just hold the blade out, it doesn't interfere with the cone breath, or with the cone. So I can still hit a bunch of targets with this and imbue my blade at the same time. Well, DM determined, okay, when you do it that way, you'll get a D8. It's not a whole lot more, but it's still a decent chunk of extra damage. And you're still, like, doing that offensive action and tagging people. And that only takes one of your attacks as opposed to your whole action. But you're spending a resource to do it, so, you know, you can get more out of it. But then another thought is, well, what if I take a charge of my breath weapon and devote it entirely to imbuing the blade? Like, the character puts the sword in his mouth, closes his mouth, and uses the breath weapon full force, but kind of keeps it in his mouth and drags the blade, like, to kind of set the scene and what it would look like. But, like, what would that do? Is it just you get that 2d10 on the blade? Well, that's not very economical, because one, it's like just an extra 2d10 that I could just spit at a bunch of targets and do way more damage. If I'm fighting a single boss, then if that takes my whole action, it's definitely not worth it. I'd rather just swing my sword twice. If it takes one of my attacks, well, it would probably be more worth it to just spit the normal breath weapon, hold the blade out, get a chance to do a full 2d10 damage, and get an extra d8. It's probably better to do that. So, like, if you want to make that version where you, like, focus your breath weapon charge entirely onto the weapon, you would have to make it do more damage, or make the charge more persistent. Like, because that's one of the key factors about this weapon's balancing, is that when it gains like an elemental imbuement, it only lasts for one hit. But so if you want to make focusing your breath weapon down, it either has to do like double breath weapon damage, it's got to do, or it has to stick around for a few hits, which that could be a thing, like, because it's a specific, like, magical breath effect that this family has used, being used on the blades that this family has had in their employ for generations. Like, well, maybe this is a special case where this charge can stick around for a bit. If that's the case, then maybe it's not the full damage of the breath weapon. It's, you know, it's not a full 2d10, it's just a d10. But you keep it for like a few rounds, or for maybe like, I don't know, you could determine like, what's your proficiency bonus? It's 3. Okay, so it sticks around for 3 hits. So you can get a total of like 3d10. And then, if that's the case, it would be more economical versus a single target. So that might be a better way to go about it. But then another factor of these blades that was brought up, like, okay, it absorbs magical energy. Can I use it to like cut a spell aimed at me? And that caused a whole another trail of discussion, which basically the DM has come up with rules that are like basically a whole subclass by themselves, like a spell cutter subclass, which would be super cool. But it's just a thing this weapon can do once the character like gains more mastery over these swords, so it's not something I have right now. But like, these rules are very, very complex, and it's stuff like, one, there's 2 different stances you can use, like a more offensive style or a more defensive style. And like the offensive, I only read through the rules once, so I'm gonna butcher them. But it's like, the offensive style seems to be more about like imbuing the blade and getting that damage in there, whereas the defensive style is more about like negating the damage you can take from it. And I'm not sure if that's the exact like fantasy I had in mind when I mentioned it, but it was a very loose kind of idea, and I've been thinking about it since we talked about it hours ago, and then the DM just sent me these rules, so I've kind of been thinking about it on my own. And well, first let me explain 1 or 2 of the rules. It's stuff like when there's a spell aimed at you, that's like a spell save DC. Like, okay, I got to make a dex save, and then on a successful save, then I can also make an attack roll, and the armor class for the attack or for the spell is whatever the save DC is plus like 3. And then if I succeed, then I reduce damage even more and imbue the blade. But if I fail, then I actually take a little more damage. It goes from like, you know, if it's a half damage on a successful save type of effect, then I go from taking 50% damage to like 75% damage. And then, but because it's the offensive style, then I still imbue the blade, but I take extra damage. So I think these rules work. They'll probably work well enough. They're really complex, so it'll be like tricky to implement them and like get them to work right. But like, the basic idea that I was thinking was like a basic version of it. Be like, okay, if it's a spell effect aimed at just you, you can try to cut it. Maybe you still have to make a saving throw, and if you succeed the saving throw, or if you just barely fail it, I don't know what. Yeah, because I feel like avoiding a saving throw and not having to spend a resource to do it is maybe a little goofy. So you'd have to succeed on the saving throw first, and then you get a chance to cut the spell and gain power that way. But that just means like you have an extra level of defense, essentially. Like the way I was thinking about it, maybe I don't like it anymore. Maybe it is better to use these rules, because like an enemy throwing a spell that costs a resource at you, something has to happen. Like, you can't just avoid it for free. But then there's the idea of like, okay, like I was thinking about it like more defensively. Like, you can attempt to cut the spell maybe before you even have to make the saving throw, and if you cut the spell, then like you automatically succeed. It just uses your reaction, which you don't normally need to use your reaction to make a saving throw. then there's like the argument of whether it's if it targets just you, then it's whatever. But then like if it's a fireball? Can you just cut that and then like kill it and save the whole party? That would be cool, honestly. But because these swords absorb elemental and or magical powers, so it kind of makes sense. Yeah, and I'm not really sure where I'm going with this discussion, but let's see. Let me think a little bit more. How could that potentially work? Like, maybe it is just whenever a spell effect is about to happen. Maybe if it targets you specifically, you can spend your reaction, make an attack roll versus the spell save DC +3, or if it's an attack roll spell, you just make an attack roll versus the other attack roll. Maybe they get a bonus to it, I don't know. And then if you succeed, you either automatically succeed on the save, or you half damage and then you have to make the save anyway, to determine if it's halved again, or you avoid negative effects or something, which I think has some pretty good that's a pretty good implementation of fantasy. Like, somebody shoots like a mind control blast at you and you manage to cut it, but you still failed the save. So it shows that this character was quick enough to like intercept the spell, but the spell still managed to take hold, but now at like a reduced effect. So if it's like a charm effect that lasts a minute, maybe now it lasts half a minute. I don't know. But then if it's an area of effect spell, it's like, because that's a big area and it's not like focused entirely on you, maybe then the sword is just automatically imbued regardless of what happens. But maybe those AoE spells are harder to interact with and harder to cut, so you don't have access to that yet. Like, there's levels to this, I don't know what they are, but like, they're harder to perform. So maybe it's, once you do gain the ability to do that, maybe you can attempt, like, if you're in the area of effect, maybe you have to be close to the epicenter, or however the spell works. Let's just say you don't, and you can just, there was a controlled burn over here. So, there's like a fireball, and you just you can spend your reaction and attempt to cut it. And if you're successful, like, same thing. It's spell save DC plus a number. Make an attack roll. And if you're successful, then you cut it, and then it's like the effectiveness is thereby immediately cut in half. So if it's this fireball that's going to do like 36 damage, let's say, you cut it in half, now it's only doing 18 damage. Yeah, 18 damage. And then everybody gets to make their saving throw, and then if they make it, then it gets reduced even further. But again, that's free use, and negating a single target spell to yourself is one thing, but negating it to the whole party might be a little much for something that just spends a reaction. Maybe you need an elemental charge in this already in order to do that. That could work. But this is going to be an ongoing project that we're going to develop, and I get the feeling maybe this will just turn into a subclass later, or just the most complicated set of weapons I've ever seen in a game. Yeah.